Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name's Steve Cohen. I'm Executive Director of the Earth Institute and a professor in the practice of public affairs at the School of International Public Affairs. And welcome to Is Sustainability Sustainable? Discussion about the Bloomberg era and what happens after it. New York City's sustainability leadership is undeniable, and it's on clear display in the long-term initiative PlaNYC, A Greener, Greater New York. While national governments have been trying to negotiate treaties without success and arguing back and forth, local governments around the world have been taking action and have been looking ahead to how do we build a sustainable future. No plan is a cure-all, but PlaNYC has stimulated real progress in both mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to the effects of climate change, and is serving as a model for cities around the globe. This plan was an initiative championed by Mayor Michael Bloomberg, starting back around 2007, and led by the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. And its goal is to prepare the city for 1 million more residents by 2030, to build a stronger economy, and to deal with the effects of climate change, all while making the city a better place to live. The plan targets what I sometimes call the physical dimensions of sustainability: housing and neighborhoods, parks and public spaces, brownfields, waterways, water supply, transportation, energy, air quality, solid waste, and climate change. The plan, through its 132 initiatives and over 400 specific milestones, is path-breaking and action-oriented. Since PlaNYC's inception, New York City has achieved the cleanest air quality in 50 years and is passing the halfway mark to the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030. The Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability has been creative and strategic in helping to achieve these goals, using zoning to remove barriers to entry for green roofs, using building codes to enhance the energy performance of our building stock, using volunteers to help us reach the goal of planting 1 million new trees, just to name a few of the more visible initiatives. However, some may argue that these sustainability policies are so identified with Mayor Michael Bloomberg that they may suffer under a different mayor with different priorities. Tonight's panel will ask the question, is sustainability sustainable? And with the mayoral election drawing closer, what's next for the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability in the post-Bloomberg era? How can we ensure that the progress that we're making continues? And so to answer that question, we are very fortunate tonight that we have with us Rohit Aggarwala and Sergej Mahnovksi. Rohit was the first head of New York City's Sustainability Office, and Sergej is the current head of the same office. Coincidentally, both are on the faculty of Columbia University. Sergej is an adjunct professor, and he teaches on urban energy, and Rohit is a professor of practice, and he teaches on the history of urban sustainability. Now, you all have their biographies in front of you, and so I'm not going to go into detail on that. I'm going to sit down and hopefully begin a conversation with these guys. Okay, so I want you to both reflect on this office that you started and you're running today, and tell me a little bit about how did this start? What drove the mayor to do it? And why has it been so successful in your mind?
Well, let's see. First of all, thank you for hosting us. Thank you for hiring both of us. You know, you're in rare company to be somebody that both Sergej and I work for. There's only one other person.
I'm the only one who's not a billionaire, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you may get the short end of the stick. So PlaNYC started, in fact, not as an environmental initiative, right? I think one of the things that we forget a little bit is that it was fundamentally a strategic plan for growth and quality of life. right? It's a little bit hard to think back now to 2005, shortly after the mayor was reelected the first time, when New York City had been only a couple of years into this growth period where it had surpassed its previous maximum population, right? The city had grown until about 1970, then the city's population plummeted, and although the population began to return in the 1980s, it was still always recovering. So you could argue that there was an infrastructure for 8 million people that we hadn't maxed out until about 2000, right? And what that led to, I think it explains how the city itself began to feel more crowded, and issues around development and how neighborhoods were densifying, and you began to see really for the first time in New York an anti-growth argument developing between 2003, say, and 2005. And it was really that challenge that, okay, if we're going to maintain a quality of life for the people who are here, you fundamentally have two alternatives. You can cap growth, which many cities around the country and increasingly around the world have tried to do. Usually not a good strategy, because either it stunts the economy, right? It stagnates, sorry, I'm missing the right word. It leads to the stagnation of the economy. Or if the economy remains vibrant despite that, what it does is it drives up prices and drives people to move out, right? And so PlaNYC started to figure out the alternative to that, which is how do you grow? How do you add more people to a constrained space while having an improved quality of life, which means infrastructure investment? It also means a smarter, more efficient use of that infrastructure. And that's really how we began to learn sustainability, was if you ask the question of how do you have a better quality of life for an increasing number of people in a constrained space, what you have is exactly the same question that the entire planet is facing. Right? And the answers, of course, are density, efficiency, cleaner air, all the things about being smarter that at the end we realized were sustainability. But that was the result. It wasn't the way it started.
Sergej, to what degree is that dynamic of accommodating the city's growth and integrating economic growth and environmental protection still there and at the center of what your office works on?
Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's always good to be with Rit and you. I think that heart and soul is still there in the group, and my role in the final mayoral term, 2010, 2011, I was the head of the energy team for the city, and then when the mayor appointed me the head of LTPS, we merged that energy team with the sustainability team, and I think one area that we were going to really focus on, with Adam Fried at the time and Leah Cohen, we were talking about really putting resilience, taking it to the next level, and really including it in our long-term view of the energy sector in particular, and so of course a week later Sandy happened. So our team really, this incarnation was really born of the Sandy experience in many ways. You had, at least for about a month, maybe 3 weeks, team members who were delivering fuels to shelters, who were helping coordinate emergency generators to hospitals, dewatering, coordinating with the utilities. And so I think we came out of that with really three teams joined forces: the core sustainability team, the energy team, which is really kind of a utility regulatory supply side team, and a resilience team. And I think at this point what we have is, I think, a 25 to 30 person strong unit. And one of the, if you look at some of the big questions of the day that we're facing, the architecture of the energy system is being reevaluated in many ways. You have changes at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, at the state commissions, obviously the mayor and Con Edison. So you have billions of dollars at stake in the future of that system. You also have really a resilience plan that was built out of from whole cloth in June when the mayor issued that. So the core of the team is still focused on basic quality of life issues, how to accommodate a million more residents by 2030, doing it in a sensible way. I think one area where we focused on is the fact that now we're talking about post Sandy and with the transitions at the state also working, city agencies are working very well together. We're building on the shoulders of giants. You've successfully seeded this plan so that it's part of the lifeblood of the city. And now we're also faced with federal and state issues where we need to punch above our weight to keep New York City on the map, and that's the next challenge.
Well, I think if I could actually, build on that, one of the observations that I make as and Sergej and I talk on occasion is that a number of the things that are more traditionally considered the real quality of life issues in PlaNYC did get taken over by the appropriate agencies. Right, and so if you think about this, PlaNYC started in this office. Of course, it was always a coordinated effort. When we developed the plan, I had a staff of 9, but there were 200 people who worked on various parts of PlaNYC across all sorts of agencies. Right? And driving the schoolyards to playgrounds into the Parks Department, or million trees into the Parks Department, thinking about, nobody needs to tell Jeanette Sadekhan to work harder to build more bike lanes, right? There were certain things that all of a sudden the agencies started to do, and we built on that more and more. And when, in fact, Kaz Holloway, who's now deputy mayor, became commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection, he brought over staff from LTPS, and all of a sudden another agency had a sustainability assistant commissioner. And that's how you drive some of these change ideas into the agencies. They then no longer have to take so much time from the central mayoral office.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the role of leadership here, because clearly Mike Bloomberg and his articulation of this, in essence, using the mayor's office, using initially you and Dan Doctoroff to sort of drive this, and then continuing to institutionalize it directly under Cass as it is today, the way that it's happening now. Is that part of what makes the Jeanette Sadekhans and the other commissioners respond, knowing that this is important to the mayor himself? How important has the mayor's leadership been to this? I know it's a softball question, but I still would like to hear what you guys have to say about it.
The mayor's leadership has been fundamental. If you look at not only, for example, recruiting team members, we're able to take some people who are willing to take a massive pay cut from the consulting industry or from elsewhere to come join us, which helps. And also, and Rick had been there for much longer, but I can reflect on it personally, is having the mayor and the deputy mayor's support is tremendous, because ultimately it's fun. At the end of the day, they care about the public interest always, and they care about the most efficient allocation of resources to help basic quality of life for New Yorkers. So you're always tested against the numbers. They test your methodology, and if you can prove to them that you have a good case to make, they more likely than not are supportive of the policies that you're recommending. So from that standpoint, it's been it's just been a tremendous experience for me.
What's your take, Rick?
Well, I had one of New York City's leading real estate developers tell me as I was leaving the City Hall in 2010, he said, well, Rick, I don't think you realize that what Mike Bloomberg did is he legitimized sustainability among New York City's decision makers, both public and private, right? And so I think it's easy for us to think about the impact on city agencies, which of course was there. As soon as the plan, as we developed the plan, people had reservations or weren't sure this was the way to go. But once the mayor starts talking about it, people begin to fall in line, and then they become creative and push the envelope on their own, which is great. But I think the way the city has responded speaks volumes to the mayor's leadership even more than the way city government has responded.
That's a good point. What's striking to me is, when I talk to people around the city about the sustainability plan, whether you're talking to somebody who's building an office building or you're talking to an environmental advocacy group, they are basically together on this in a way that you typically don't see in a city. That the wedding of economic development and environmental protection, the argument is, of course, if you don't have clean air and clean water and a safe environment, nobody wants to live in the place. I think places like Beijing are starting to face up to that. But is it all the leadership, or is it that the people running New York are just smarter than other places? What do you think?
Well, we'll see.
Is that the transition discussion? I mean, what do you, I mean, this is sort of the punchline, but let's start with that, and then I want to circle back a little bit into the Sandy discussion, because I think that's, you know, with the 1 year anniversary, I know it's on everybody's mind, but what do you think is going to happen under the next mayor?
Oh, Jesus. We're getting to the tough question right away.
Yeah. Before drinks
I think
have been
since I have to punt on that one, I think.
Yeah, fair enough. Look, I think as I watched, and of course, as some of you know, I'm in the process of moving back home from California, so I watched a lot of this from afar. But looking at the various mayoral debates, the one on which there was almost entire unanimity was the one the League of Conservation Voters hosted about the environmental agenda, where basically every candidate, with the exception of Mr. Katsimatidis, said, no, of course, we should continue to do exactly what Mayor Bloomberg has been doing, right? So what I expect is rhetorically there will still be support for all of this. The questions will be really around the execution, the way it's managed internally, and when push comes to shove, when there are important specific decisions that the mayor needs to back, will the next mayor make that decision, and similarly, will the next council speaker make that decision? Because Chris Quinn deserves a great deal of credit for what we achieved at PlaNYC. She was willing to give us the benefit of the doubt. She was willing to work with us. Sometimes she was willing. I mean, the relationship between the two of them was really important in the sense that at important moments, they were willing to allow the other one to get a little more credit. Right. And that ultimately, you know, it's one of those quotes that it's unclear exactly who really said it first, but, you know, if you're willing to give somebody else credit, you can get almost anything done. Right.
And see, I think that's the key. I mean, in our shop, we try to keep as apolitical as possible, and we try to let the numbers speak for themselves. And I think, you know, and RIT really set the tone back in 2006 and 7, and I think at this point we have, I think, the strongest municipal sustainability team anywhere as far as, you know, the quality of the product. I mean, we ultimately have to go to regulators to convince them to make, you know, changes to the system or pay for certain things that we're asking for. So, and I think that's really, you know, RIT and the mayor set the tone. So when we go there, they know that we're very serious and that we're going to be backed up by a tremendous amount of analytics. But I think it's important to also talk about maybe specific programs and how tricky getting things done can be. For example, you know, the mayor a couple weeks ago announced that the city has the cleanest air that it's had in 50 years. That's attributable to a number of factors, but one of them, for example, has been our so-called clean heat program, which is an effort to really take refined products and heavy fuel oil outside of the residential commercial sector. You know, right now, 10,000 buildings that burn these heavy fuel oils contribute as much particulate matter emissions as any other source. And if you think about how difficult it is to accelerate a program like that, let's take a look at that. First, you need not only to have the, you know, the regulatory power to enact that change, but also to understand, you know, what financing can you bring to bear? How do you get the real estate community on board? Then as you go out from that, you realize, well, guess what? The utility doesn't have enough gas service to feed those residences, and so you can't finance it without the gas. So then you work with the utility and the Public Service Commission to get them on board. And then you realize, well, guess what? The city doesn't have enough natural gas even to feed it. So then you work with the pipeline companies, and you work with, then you look at the renewables and distributed generation aspect of this. So every problem ends up being, if you look at the entire chain, is a very complex issue involving buy-in from community boards, from the real estate community, from finance, from the state. And you know, that's what makes it a fun job. But you need, that's why the leadership at the top is incredibly important. Otherwise, it can just fall apart, and it becomes a small initiative that doesn't move the needle on things that actually matter to us.
Yeah.
You know,
I used to joke, if I could add on that, you know, people looked at congestion pricing, which we tried, of course, in 2007, and we lost the fight in 2008, and people looked at it as a terrible loss for PlaNYC, which of course it was, and I think the city would be much better off with it. But one of the things it did, in addition to what Sergej's talking about in terms of the quality of the research that has always backed up PlaNYC, is it gave us, you know, people thought that congestion pricing was a terrible, crazy, dangerous idea. And then Mike Bloomberg goes out and says, no, we should do this. He put his hand on this third rail. I used to joke that after that, I could walk into a conference room and say, oh yeah, the mayor's considering banning skyscrapers. And people would take me seriously, right? Because it's like, wait a minute, he's so committed to this, maybe he'd do anything. And there is something to that in terms of being willing to stand behind something. If you go to the real estate industry and you say, you know what, there are 10,000 buildings and we want them to change their boilers in a relative hurry, right? The initial reaction 5-10 years ago would have been, yeah, whatever, right? Never going to happen, right? In this case, it's, well, okay, they probably will have a plan and we're going to have to engage.
There's going to be follow through. There's going to be analytics, and a lot of these are also informal relationships because I think they trust the mayor's office to be not only good brokers of information but honest, and also telegraphing the plan and resourcing it properly. So that makes it so much easier to go out and get the support of the stakeholders.
Well, what's striking about this conversation is, let's contrast this to the conversation we just finished in Washington, where in fact you have government defined as evil and a problem, and we have to starve the beast, and the private sector is the only place where good things happen. And here in New York City, you see a genuine partnership between the nonprofit sector, community-based groups, advocacy groups, the public sector and the government, and the private sector working together on these issues. And I mean, part of what it says to me is that that at this level at least, reality takes hold and there's a true conversation. The question is, and one of the things everybody is talking about now is, will this continue? Is it so institutionalized in the fabric of the city? And again, I think, Britt, you pointed out something that's really correct. It's not just in the government, it's in the private sector. And I'd argue it's also in the advocacy groups, and the environmental groups, and the community groups who may have initially not felt a stake in PlaNYC, but over time started to be brought into the process. So is that something that we can count on going forward?
Well, you can count on, I think, advocacy and the private sector to continue doing what they're doing. I think, again, the key question is going to be, will the next mayor be willing to take the hard decisions at the moments when the mayor has to do so personally, right? When there is somebody's ox that has to be gored, but the facts are there, the plan is sound, somebody's got to be pushed, right? Is the mayor going to look that in the face and say, yes, let's do it because it's the right thing to do, right? That's one question. The second question is the next mayor going to hold the research to the same high standard, right? Because you have governments around, and it's not just Washington. Certain political leaders, certain governments are willing to make policy based on shoddy data, are willing to cook the books. If that tradition is dropped, then...
I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think Ritt's right. You have to keep that leadership there, that vision. If you look at, another point that he made I think is very important, that you often make about PlaNYC, that really started off as a quality of life and economic development initiative. And that's what almost all of our initiatives do boil down to, things that affect people's lives, which is the reason I think cautiously optimistic that it's going to continue, because it's not just esoteric. It's real, and people can, the air quality, we're in 4th place right now among major cities. We were in 7th place a couple years ago. In 2003, a quarter of our power plants burn heavy fuel oil, and I mean, if you look at the environmental changes that have happened, they're tremendous. Regarding the quality of the team, if you look at, that's the real gem, I think. If you look at, we were able to recruit, PhDs in electrical engineering, who look at, hey, can we create microgrid clusters around hospitals?
PhDs running the office, by the way.
We have Fulbright scholars. We've got people flocking. I'd say the intellectual ferment in that office is comparable to any consultancy or think tank that I've been a part of, and I would go to bat with that team anywhere. I mean,
well, it's interesting. We've done a lot of Columbia students have worked as interns and full-time employees there. And in fact, we've done a lot of workshop projects for your office over the years, and so that the issue of analysis is obviously important to us. We're here in Low Library at Columbia University, so clearly this is a place that values that kind of firepower. How central? I mean, both of you have been talking about the analytic firepower of the office and of the government. Is that something? Is that sustainable? Is that something that we can that we from the university or from the community that we can do to sort of push that on the next mayor?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't actually thought about that, but you are totally right that there has been an intellectual bent to the office that characterizes it, which is not always true for a mayoral office, not always true for an executive office. I think actually one of the bigger questions is, and not to belittle the question of who gets appointed to be Sergej's successor, right? But is where that person sits, right? Now, currently it is mandated by law, a law that we helped draft along with Chris Quinn, that there must be a mayor's office of sustainability, but of course we all know that a law like that, you could have one person named to be the director of that office and no power, and the bulk of the responsibility is transferred into city planning or transportation or somewhere else. And I think that would be a terrible tragedy, because then you'd structurally lose the idea of a central staff that has, even if you don't have to go micromanage what transportation does on bike lanes, you're still gathering the information, you're still doing the annual report, you're still keeping track of the carbon footprint. And we would lose that if it goes into one agency.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's ways of modifying some of the mission and still keeping the heart and soul of the long-term planning, sustainability office alive. I think it's a gem that I'm optimistic that when you look at the staff and what they're doing, it doesn't neatly fall in any agency, and you need the level of coordination that some of our folks are. And they're not just researchers. I mean, we have 257 initiatives right now on resilience, and we're tracking every single one of them every day. And there's not going to be any other agency that is going to span, building codes and hospitals and the grid and a coastal measure. If it disintegrates into a couple different agencies, you kind of lose the thinking of how do you optimize around this? How do you really look at the whole system? So I think.
Let's go back to Sandy, because here you have a crisis, a transformative event. Any event that gets Chris Christie to hug Barack Obama is a transformative event. So you see this dramatic change, and you have the governor of New York saying, this came about, the intensity of the storm has to be attributed to climate change. You have a poll, I think it was a Siena poll, said over 70% of the people in New York State believed that climate change was in part a cause of this. So you have what we social scientists like to call a paradigm shift. People are starting to think about this. And I sense in your discussion of PlaNYC and of your office that the resiliency task and the crisis of both rebuilding after Hurricane Sandy and responding to it has, in some respects, changed the mission of the office. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how things have changed, and then we'll see how rich grading you're on that, okay?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, I think because a lot of our team, the team was basically seconded into the emergency operations for a good month and involved in the writing of the special initiative report. So I think that experience changed a lot of people. Some people, as I mentioned, were out emergency shelters, some people in the Rockaways, some people coordinating with the utilities, and they saw, firsthand what happened. And so I think our team's a little bit more delivery oriented. There's a more excuse me. How can I put this? We have about 30 team members. They're all very different. The teams are very different, but I think the resilience part of it now is integral to what we do. And in fact, Rohit and I were joking in the backstage there about maybe we should start redefining sustainability, come up with some new vocabulary words, but it is one thing now. Resilience and sustainability is our work hand in glove, really, in our team. And at the macro level, obviously, you can't really deal with one without the other. I mean, we've estimated that, we've seen something like $19 billion of damage in New York City from the storm. If you were to take the same probability event and you look at the sea level rise in 2050, it would have been a $90 billion event. And so mitigation, if you don't do mitigation, you're going to have a problem on the resilience side. So we see that as philosophically the two have to be hand in hand, and that's why we see it as part part of one shop, really.
I should say my colleague Klaus Jacob out there is probably thinking he's dreaming hearing somebody from the mayor's office talk about 2050 and $90 billion. So no, Klaus, it's really happening. It's part of the process now. So from your perspective, Rick, do you see this resiliency as something that's integral now to this task? Was it a distraction from the longer term thinking? I mean, one of the dangers in government is that emergencies sometimes drive out long-term thinking, or is in fact resiliency the ultimate long-term project for the city of New York?
Look, I think, so my perspective on that, two points I'll make. One is, I am a little bit worried that, and less so here in New York, but more broadly, that resilience and adaptation have taken the wind out of the objective of reducing carbon emissions, right? And so keeping that in balance is a critical task. Now, I think it's a reasonable thing to argue that due to the success we had in the first 5 years of PlaNYC, we pulled many of the key levers that the city could do, that, you know, it's not time just yet for another big push on building efficiency. It's not time, you know, there's a cadence to policy making. You can't have a massive new policy initiative on the same issue every 18 months, right? So I am a little bit worried about that. However, the other thing that I realize, and it's fascinating to hear Sergej describe it this way, because my experience with realizing the challenges around adaptation and some of the constraints that we faced early on, and some that, you know, Klaus worked with us on, was that I fought very hard to have climate change adaptation in the first plan. And that gave the OLTPS the right to tackle climate change adaptation, right? But what we quickly began to realize was that it was not a question just around climate change. It was, as Sandy demonstrated, a question of pre-existing risk that hadn't been dealt with, right? And there, one of the things that we really struggled with was that we had not been given the mandate to go work directly with the Office of Emergency Management in a way to make them think about some of these challenges, right? So this baptism by fire, where these two things were integrated, and we realized that, okay, you know, you can plan for the sea level rise that the New York Panel on Climate Change projected, but if you don't deal with the remedial action of dealing with the existing vulnerability, you know, you're going to have what we did, which was we began towards a 20-year plan, and I continue to think that had Sandy come 20 years from now, the existing plans in place would have dealt with many of those issues, because we had, I think, soundly planned for the delta, but we had not soundly planned for the existing risk. And so that's a question of how you frame an issue, just like if you frame the issue around quality of life or just environmentalism, you get a different plan. If you frame an issue around climate change adaptation, you get one set of solutions. If you frame it around overall resilience, you get a much more comprehensive set.
And I think, you know, to Rick's credit, actually, if you look at the original plan, a lot of these pieces are there. It has had a lot of foresight, looking at the sea level rise at the battery and so forth. I think one of the things that we found, and, you know, again, when our energy team was being integrated with sustainability, we saw that this issue needed to go to the next level. Really, we needed to go to regulators to, you know, and one of the challenges was, how do you get climate scientists talking to utilities and regulators? They were talking past each other for a long period of time, despite the fine work on both sides, perhaps. But and so, you know, the panel on climate change and Cynthia Rosenzweig and others, I think, if you look at what they've been able to do right now, we're actually in a process right now with our regulators. It's an unprecedented process, really looking at, you know, a $1 billion storm plan and trying to do a cost benefit around it. And really from a risk standpoint, taking sea level rise and modeling of floods and waves and all this to look at actually long-term capital spending in the utility sector. I mean, it's almost unprecedented. And that really was born of the original plan and how it's evolved. And then of course, Sandy. Because, you know, in the past when we had gone to regulators, it wasn't something that really rose to the level of decision making. So that combination of things, I think we're in a very different place right now. So,
Do you think that this resiliency plan, the $20 billion plan, which we hear is $15 billion funded, or I guess $10 billion solid, $5 billion sort of, $5 billion let's pray for it, is the priority behind this going to remain, or do we have to have another storm like that to remind people that these things just don't fade away?
well, many of the initiatives are now programmed in, and it's going to be, but it's a long-term set of plans. I mean, some initiatives are short-term, things that you can do relatively quickly, beach nourishment, things like that, building up bulkheads, things like that take a little bit longer, building codes and so forth, building up the utility system. It's a many-layered plan, and so the next leadership is going to have to take their look at it. But I think they're very solidly grounded in the fundamentals, and I think they're well prioritized in my view. So I think, and the other thing we were careful about is making sure it wasn't just about Sandy, right? Because if the tidal surge had hit, so the tides between Long Island Sound and the New York Harbor are off by like 6 to 8 hours. So if the storm had hit 8 hours before, Long Island Sound and Astoria, Hunts Point area would have been hit more than different parts of the city. So we're always very mindful of, don't fight the last war. And not only that, but, we've seen in 2 summers of historic heat waves. Well, historic peak load associated with heat waves, and we're also hit by Irene. So I think that experience helped shape what we're doing, and also getting input from communities. It's not a total central plan. We have, tremendous amount of input from the communities that were affected, and I think that's where you really get the buy-in.
So sitting in California, where you were for the last few years watching this, what do people out there think about all this? I mean, in some respects, this is where, the West Coast is where sustainability in some respects was invented. Cities like Portland and Seattle were at this before we were, although not quite in the way you're defining it. I mean, there was more of a environmental initiative. Here, it really does come out of a quality of life economic development initiative. But I mean, when you're not in the middle of this kind of thing, I mean, you sat in the middle of this and dealt with all the intensity, and then you had the ability to remove yourself. What did that perspective give you as you thought about what the city was going through and your own contributions?
Wow, that's a deep question. I don't know if I'm quite that introspective yet. Look, I think what New York has done is, well, first of all, I guess, I think New York has made a splash around the world on this issue, right? In part because we did a good job, in part because it's New York, right? And, as the mayor often jokes about smoking, California banned smoking several years before the Bloomberg administration did New York. California did it, and the world said, yeah, that's just California. New York did it, and the world said, oh, we should take this seriously, and all of a sudden Italy is banning smoking, right? And I think sustainability has had a similar impact, that you can write off Portland and Curitiba and Heidelberg as being blips, but when New York really focuses on it, they're kind of cold-blooded or calculating, or they're all about the money, so there must be something real to this. Right, I think there's something to that.
So you're welcome back to New York.
Yeah, I feel more natural here, definitely. Yeah. But I guess in the flip side is there is, in certain circles in California, a certain jealousy of what we've done, and I was always tickled pink that I couldn't hear Gavin Newsom, the former mayor of San Francisco and current lieutenant governor, speak about sustainability and him not take a swipe at Mike Bloomberg, which suggested to me that there was a certain amount of jealousy there. So I think that was great. What's fantastic, though, going forward is I think there is a wave, there's a series of changes in terms of how sustainability has been perceived and defined, right? And I think you've touched on them. There's originally there was arguably a place like Portland. Now New York City has kind of redefined it. I expect the next redefinition of sustainability after this fuller integration of resilience and sustainability will actually be in developing countries. It will be around how do you turn Bombay or Sao Paulo or a place like one of those cities or Lagos, how do you green a city with massive informal settlements without sewage systems that have 750,000 people living in one slum, right? That's going to be the next wave. And I think that an interesting challenge, kind of wearing my C40 Cities hat, is how do you find the lessons from the Portlands and Curitibas, and then from the New York, Tokyo, Londons, right, that these other cities can make use of in a productive way?
Yeah, those are clearly going to be the challenges of the
That's, you know, that's what I tell all my students that they have to go figure out, actually.
Well, it'll be nice to see. Well, let's turn back to New York and thinking about January 1st when there'll be a new mayor. And let's think about what would you guys say to the new mayor about sustainability and your office? In other words, there'll be a transition team. It'll probably be a little bit before that. It'll happen in the next, actually it'll start in a few weeks. The transition team's going to call you in, and Rit, maybe they'll call you in too. And they'll ask, you know, what do we do about this? I mean, one of the things that I actually remember about Mike Bloomberg when he took office was the first thing he did is he sat down publicly with Freddie Ferrer. And the second thing is he spent 3 hours with our colleague David Dinkins saying, you were a mayor, what does that involve? And so hopefully there'll be people on the next team that'll ask you that question. So what's the big challenges that you're seeing, and what advice do you want to give?
Oh, geez, that's a... Steve, I got to think about that for a second. I mean, I guess one of the first things I would say is try to describe the team that the next mayor has, and just describe how phenomenal that group of people is, and how they can be really a force multiplier for anything that the future mayor does in sustainability and quality of life. And I think that's important to articulate, because a lot of what we do is sometimes behind the scenes, doesn't see the public view. A couple areas that come to mind immediately, I mentioned before on the energy side, which is really my area of expertise. You have, again, the architecture of the system is being evaluated right now, and New York City has to stay at the center of that, because it's going to impact our air quality, our reliability of the systems, the prices that we pay for energy. And I think we have a tremendous ability to not only increase the amount of renewables penetration in the city, go deeper in energy efficiency, but also really look at New York City's been a really leader in innovation, and we don't want to lose that. If you look at, for example, the Applied Science Campus, the fact that we're really creating a living laboratory out of municipal assets, that's something that is easy to lose, but this is an area that we are, I think, the mayor's really set a tremendous pathway. On the resilience side, I think we've got a solid plan, and it's just I would recommend in many cases we're going to be having a continuing interaction with the federal and state governments. It's going to be incredibly important in order to make sure that we get our fair share of money. There's going to be an issue of affordability regarding flood insurance that is not yet addressed, and that's a really important issue. I could go on and on. But I think I have to reflect on that a little bit more. So.
Okay. Rit, what would you tell the new team?
Well, I think one is don't break what has been done, right? If what came up at that League of Conservation Voters mayoral forum is it all true, then we've taken, as Sergej said, we've depoliticized this issue to a certain extent. So while inevitably Mike Bloomberg's name will be attached to it for some time, there should not be a reason that either Joe Lhota or Bill de Blasio would find it in his own self-interest to undo it, right? I think that's a critical thing. Mayors often, I mean, as we all know, Giuliani built on the policing tactics that David Dinkins put in place. There are lots of things where mayors actually do continue what their predecessors have done. So I think that's one. I think to the extent that the next mayor wants to make the environment something that he, I guess we don't have a significant female candidate, that he wants to make his name on, I think you'd have to choose something that's a little bit different, because otherwise it would seem a Me Too strategy. But there are a bunch of those. The mayor tackled noise early in his administration, but certainly noise is a quality of life and environmental pollution issue that deserves some attention. I think it was always on my wish list that we could really get into indoor air quality in a structural way. Because I think that's another area that particularly as we get closer to this goal of having the cleanest air of any big city in America, which again, nobody thought was, I mean, we always thought that was a crazy rhetorical thing, but we're actually getting there. The idea of indoor air, in fact, becomes more important to tackle than ambient air. And so those are probably two. And then, you might think about having tackled the skyscrapers, as most of our buildings initiatives have really focused on the larger buildings. There are, 700,000 single-family or 1 to 4 family homes in this city, and you might make a big push on those. Those are probably the 3 areas that if the next mayor wants to do something on, those I would...
And speaking of energy efficiency, if you look at, right now, we're in the 3rd year of benchmarking, and we're going to get some of the audit results. You have a gold mine of information about really the DNA of buildings that no other city has to this level. What is it? Where San Francisco and Boston combined 2 billion square feet. That is just a tremendous resource, not only for crafting public policy and also for the building owners and tenants and the investment community. That information is going to I think really change the pace of energy efficiency investments and building codes.
I think it's an interesting question about whether, in fact, the issue has been depoliticized. LaGuardia famously said there's no Democratic or Republican way to pick up the garbage, and I think if it truly is essential quality of life, and I think in some respects it's been defined that way, it has a potential of becoming that kind of consensus issue, and we'll have to see how it develops. I think at this point, why don't we open up this conversation to questions? Now, let me just urge questions, not comments, not speeches, questions from the audience to see what you'd like to hear these gentlemen speak about. There's a microphone there. Here's a question right up here. Oh, you have one there? Okay, we'll start in the back.
Hi, I'm a student from Columbia College. Thank you for being here tonight. And my question is that since November 2012, 18 cities have taken the stance to divest their holdings from the fossil fuel industry, from Seattle and San Francisco on the West Coast to Providence and Ithaca right here. What thought, if any, has your office given to divesting New York City from fossil fuels?
Isn't it nostalgic to hear college students talk about divestment again? But go ahead.
I'm sorry, my apologies. So 100% divestment from fossil fuels?
And I'm sorry, do you mean in terms of the fuel that's used in the buildings, or in terms of the...
You were talking about investment by the city government, right?
Yeah,
Right.
all pension funds or city holdings from extraction companies.
Oh, financial, okay.
Yeah, I think it's the controller
Yeah,
that you
is
should probably
actually
talk
not a
to.
mayoral policy. That is a controller policy.
And I'll give you my perspective on it, which is that my hope is that these companies will get into the renewable energy business, sort of the same way that AT&T got out of the landline business to some degree into the wireless business. And so it's not clear to me that divestment is the right strategy, although I think symbolically it's always a good way to get some people to pay attention to the damage that these companies are doing to the environment. So in that respect, I like the issue, but in the end, I'm not sure that I want to capital starve these people because I'm counting on them to invest in the renewable energy economy. Another question up here, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Joanna. I'm also researching community resilience, so thank you. It's really interesting to hear what you've said tonight. I'm like many people, I'm pretty convinced that business as usual is not going to be sustainable for us as a city or for us as a country or a world. Does PlaNYC have any policies to affect behaviour change to reduce carbon emissions within people? So, for example, reducing waste, for example.
Okay, does PlaNYC call for behavior change to reduce our carbon footprint?
Well, there are some behavior change elements actually, written during your era, the Green YC.
Didn't know I had an era.
There's a whole era.
Yeah, wow, okay.
The Aggarwala era, I think they call it, yeah.
And we'll start. I don't know
No,
if you
go
want to start
ahead,
with.
please.
And well, so for example, on the energy side, we're very supportive of, for example, sub-metering and ways for consumers to actually see their energy bill, resolving tenant-owner problems, so that consumers actually understand well, not only their energy consumption, but also the different types of waste. We have restaurant waste challenge underway right now, challenging some of the big restaurants in the city to essentially compost some of their organics. I mean, I think there are a whole number of initiatives where the idea, whether it's a commercial business or residential consumer, for example, of energy, or a commercial business that's a consumer of energy, or other products are taken to landfills, where either through a mayoral challenge where they're given credit for their reductions, or through quicker feedback as far as their consumption. I think there's a whole number of different initiatives. We also have essentially a marketing outreach campaign with NYC and Birdie. I don't know if you want to mention a couple words about that, but I think that is actually kind of the cutting edge of how to shape behavior, if you will, in this area. So I think we've touched on it in some areas, but I think there's more to be done.
But, can I make a point? Because I think actually I'd push back on the premise of your question, right? Because one of the fundamental concepts in PlaNYC is that the way New Yorkers live is actually the future, right? So if you push New Yorkers to change too far, you actually wind up in the backward bending part of the curve, right? So here is a very real way that I think we need to think about this. Environmentalism traditionally, until about 2000, right, the knee-jerk reaction was to stop growth. Right? We don't want more shopping malls, we don't want more housing, we don't want more roads, we don't want more cars, we don't want growth. Right? Which was a legitimate and logical approach at a time when virtually every piece of growth was wasteful, inefficient, terrible for the environment, and highly consumptive of fossil fuels. What you have here is the most energy and carbon efficient economy in the United States, and with the exception of Vancouver in North America. So ultimately, if every American moved to New York, the carbon footprint of the United States would be cut by far more than any country has ever managed to do it, right? In fact, we would reach almost our 80 by 50 goal. That, of course, is infeasible, but nonetheless, it's an important thing to think about, because what it requires you to worry about is the counter, right? So we have to be sensitive about the extent to which a green building effort in New York raises costs, because if you reduce energy consumption in New York by 5%, but you encourage, because you drive costs up, 0.5% of the people instead to move to New Jersey, where they consume 3 times as much energy, you've actually negated the entire value of your initiative.
And they also have to learn how to make right turns on red.
Well, yeah, there are some other cultural things they have to worry about, root for, unfortunate teams and all sorts of things. But I mean, this is actually a very real issue that informed a lot of PlaNYC, is the idea that the future is about becoming more like New Yorkers already are. Now, there are some really bad habits about New Yorkers, and I think we are finally getting to some of the smarter waste solutions that have taken a long time, and it's an issue of agencies, actually, that we finally now have a great assistant commissioner for sustainability at the Department of Sanitation, who's been driving some great policies and thinking about education. But we have to be careful to think when we think about what behaviors we want to change, because we don't necessarily need to change all of the behaviors that we have here. In fact, we need to encourage more than we want to dissuade.
There's a question over here I saw. Do we have a microphone? Okay.
I guess along those lines, what is the city planning for with regards to the subway and metro underground toxic levels? I know a postdoctoral student here at Columbia who's doing skin samples on traveling commuters, and it's quite intoxicating to see the level of toxins within the skin of anyone that's commuting here.
You understand what, it's the pollution in the subway system. Pat Kinney, actually, who is part of the Earth Institute, has been doing work with students with backpacks and air monitors and finding now, I should say that the city actually doesn't control the subway. So again, that's a state agency, but Is that something?
So I don't have an answer to that specific question, but I think one thing that our office is doing is we're working hand in hand with our Department of Health on, for example, on air quality monitoring. We have a very sophisticated survey instrument looking at sampling in different parts of the city. And that's actually fed into our program, our air quality program, and our clean heat program, and our energy program. So I think, and you're only going to see a strengthened partnership with Department of Health because they're incredibly analytical and thoughtful. And so I think we're seeing the outcome of that in some of our actual policies and the outcomes recently.
Yeah, well, look, I think your point is it's akin to what I was saying about pushing indoor air quality. I mean, you could argue whether the subways are indoor or outdoor, but either way, the environmental community has traditionally been focused on air pollution being ambient air pollution. And I think once the really obvious challenges of particulate matter and smog and soot are not tackled, but are so much better than they were, that the indoor problems begin to rise to the fore in comparison. I think those are going to have to be dealt with. What's fascinating is that that's a bit of a return, and as a public health person, you'll know this, to some of the origins of all urban planning, which is really around public health and communicable disease. Right? And so we're going to have to focus back and redefine environmentalism that way. So that, in fact, maybe answers my question about sustainability and then resilience. Maybe the next wave is a return to thinking holistically about health in an urban environment.
And that applies to heat waves as well. For example,
Yep.
most of the fatalities that happen during heat waves are elderly who are locked into essentially apartments that reach 140 degrees and hotter, and that's an indoor issue, which is in a sense much more complicated a problem to solve.
So if you're a student thinking about what you want to study and what you want to work on for the next 20 or 30 years, this is going to be a growth industry, is what you're hearing. Other questions? Over here? Yeah, whatever, you guys should pick. We'll take a couple more and then we'll do a wrap-up.
Hi, Sonali Chitra with Priyambada Sustainability Consulting. And I'm interested to know what your recommendations are for the next administration as far as policies to implement more green technologies here in the city. Things like the infrastructure for distributed solar, things like simple LED lighting retrofits. I mean, these different kinds of technologies that truly do solve the climate crisis by reducing emissions and using resources more efficiently. Are there ways the city can sort of use either public-private partnerships or bring in other kinds of other ways that we can sort of do these kinds of implementations?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think we're in the middle of a tremendous period of innovation in the energy/technology sector. And I think New York City's right in the center of it in many ways. And I think the fact that the mayor has, the fact that we have, three, science or applied science and urban informatics campuses that we've been supporting, I think is really laying the groundwork for the next generation of technologies and ideas for an urban setting. I think, I mentioned this earlier, but city government can really play a living laboratory role, taking pilot projects and integrating them, whether it's a tidal turbine or it's some kind of demand response solar battery thing. If you look at, for example, you mentioned LED lighting, Green Light New York is going to be really showcasing lighting technologies to the design community. So I think we're right at the cusp, and in other cases having more durable state-level policies on renewables helps some of those companies locate actually in New York City. Our Economic Development Corporation has a number of incentives. They have a number of competitions that they have. For example, they have a $41 million resilience competition that they're launching in the next couple months to really look at what are the best ideas out there. Because we have vendors coming to us every day with technologies all over the map. The question is which ones are actually going to work, which ones can actually be integrated into a dense urban environment. So I think I think we're right. We have companies, for example, I had a couple battery companies come to us recently where if it's true what they're telling us, the cost structure of those batteries are pretty phenomenal. You're seeing changes that I didn't expect as a former energy consultant. And so I think we're only really seeing the beginning of it.
But at the risk of being contrarian consistently, I'm gonna.
I think we have to. You're supposed to
yeah, that's true. That's my. He's still in office. I don't have the party line to toe anymore. But the risk of running towards green tech is that, number one, the technology may not be where it needs to be to scale, right? And the second is that it's a flashy object that can easily distract from the more boring but more productive or more efficient or more meaningful things to do, right? And I think that is a real temptation, in fact, that I would hope our next mayor avoids. I think you've seen that mistake made in a number of places around the country and around the world where green tech is a substitute for green, right? Because a lot of the stuff that we did that was the most important was not, in fact, high tech, right? Converting 10,000 number 6 burning boilers to natural gas, right, is hardly a cutting-edge technology, but is probably the single best thing that PlaNYC has done, right? And so I think if you lose sight, if you make technology the objective, you very easily lose sight of the actual policy objectives, which are quality of life and air quality and public health and carbon emissions and resilience.
I agree with that. It's a means. It's a means.
It
It's a
has
means
to be
to
a
an end,
means
not
to
the
an
end.
end.
I
Yeah,
totally
that's
agree with
right.
that. I mean, if you look at, sorry.
No, I think the point that we're all raising here and that we're hearing is that this is a complex, multidimensional problem that when you push in one direction, you see an effect in many other directions. And so in the end, the goal is, in fact, a sustainable city, a city where, in fact, we have a lot of goals. I mean, we want to make sure that working class people can stay in New York City. We want to keep the city internationally diverse. You know, 40% of the people that live in New York City were born in other countries. That is a fact of New York City's life that is also worth retaining. And so I think that what you're hearing, in fact, is that all these goals intersect with each other. We haven't spoken a lot about environmental justice tonight, but in fact, that's another very important goal that intersects with some of these solutions, like, for example, waste transfer stations.
Right.
So let me take one more question, and I'm going to ask our speakers to wrap up. Yes, go ahead. Pick somebody. Okay.
Hi, my name is Krista Lehman. I'm with City University of New York. So I know that there is federal aid given by the government to New York City to help rebuild. Does OLTPS get any of that? And if so, apparently not.
Do you get a percentage? That's the question.
Well, look at that suit.
So
Of course he's
no.
getting
Okay. Well, I know you guys have your resiliency plan. So did you guys, use funds
We
from
so
the city then?
So we typically, when it comes to capital projects, we typically track them. Sometimes, in rare cases, we oversee them. But typically, that's different agencies that are involved in that. There's some support that's given, for example, to our team on supporting some analytics and supporting some personnel and so forth. But most of the funding is going to specific agencies that are actually making those capital investments.
Okay, so at this point, we're going to do two more things. I'm going to ask each of our guests to give us some concluding thoughts about the future of sustainability and is sustainability sustainable in New York. And then I understand that in the back of the room, we're going to have some refreshments and ask everybody to join with us informally and see if there's some sustainable beer back there, and we will chat informally. So, Rit, why don't we start with you, and do you have any concluding thoughts to offer tonight?
Oh, look, I think, sustainability being sustainable is fundamentally a question of democracy, right? That if democracy, the people of New York will determine whether sustainability is sustainable. If the next mayor comes in and starts undoing things, if he is criticized for that vocally, if the advocates mobilize effectively, he will not be able to do that. And in fact, he will find it in his own self-interest, politically as well as altruistically, to do an even better job than we did. Right? And if New York as a society fails to worry about that, then it will probably go backwards. I do think it's a crazy thing to think about what the turnout was at the primary. Right, here we are choosing our next mayor, and something like less than a tenth of New Yorkers voted. Right, how remarkable is that? I think, in fact, a broader risk is whether, and at the risk of being a little self-congratulatory, the Bloomberg administration has run the city to a very high quality of managerial capability. I'm a little worried that some of the watchdog functions that have kept previous administrations more honest than they might otherwise have been have faded away. I don't know that the press corps is doing the same kind of research on the way city agencies are run as they might have done, because it's not that fruitful. You don't find a lot of great scandals. There was City Time was really the only one. Whereas, in fact, the scandals of administration and past administrations have been much richer for reporters. So I think that it is fundamentally a question of how well our democracy at this municipal level works, more than whether there's a challenge with sustainability in and of itself.
Sergej, your thoughts?
Well, my sense is, New Yorkers are very passionate about these topics. We don't, what's interesting is actually there's really not one issue where you find total agreement. If you want to put a solar cell on top of a landfill, you'll have a disagreement. If you want to do pretty much any sustainability initiative, there is.
There are people who object to trees.
It's
amazing.
Well, they fall, you know.
So that is the fact of life in New York City, and
We're proud of it here.
We've got thick skin, and that's how speaking about democracy, that's how things happen. So I'd say people are passionate about sustainability. People have different definitions for it, and I think that I see this functionality continuing. It might be modified here and there, but I think, as the mayor always likes to say, we all want to we're going to live here in the future. We want the next mayor to be even more successful. I'm pretty confident that, we don't know what it's going to be called and what it's going to look like exactly, but some version of this will be around several years from now.
Well, I like to think you're correct. So I'd like to thank our wonderful guests, so please join me.